Hi, everyone. This is your co-host Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist Patty Wilson. And Patty's rather excited about today's episode, so evidently it's got a pretty decent or a pretty interesting topic. So I'm sure she's going to tell me what that is, and I'm going to be just as surprised as everybody else. So, Patty, what is it?
Well, actually, I'm going to talk about colonial ghost stories
Oh,
and let everybody in on a little bit of who I am when I'm not the ghost lady. So, the other passion in my life is history, and particularly French and Indian and colonial period history. I've done living history where I've portrayed characters and dressed in costume. In fact, I lived over in Old Bedford Village in Bedford, Pennsylvania for a year. I did storytelling there. And if you came in on certain days of the week, I would be cooking in the fireplace, and some days I was school marming and stuff like that. So that is a big part of my life. Also, Bedford, the fort, we have a fort over here called Fort Bedford, and I participate with Fort Bedford as well. So it is a big part of who I am day to day. And I love colonial history. So I've been collecting up for many, many years colonial ghost stories. And thought maybe that I'd share some of my passion with all of our listeners and share some of these amazing stories. These are not just ghost stories, but you'll recognize some of the characters. Some of them are just amazing stories about people and battles and history in general. And I hope that everybody likes them. If they let me know, I'll either tell you more or not tell them to you again if you are not interested. But let us know what you think.
I can bet there's going to be one or two Mad Anthony Wayne stories then.
Oh, I love Matt Anthony. There's about five people in Pennsylvania's history that I absolutely adore. Jim
Mm.
Smith and the Black Boys, Davy Lewis, the Gentleman Bandit of Pennsylvania, and you cannot possibly pass on without loving Matt Anthony Wayne. And I'm a big Ben Franklin fan, just so you know. Maybe not of his personal life and choices, but of him as a politician, a leader, explorer, a scientist. Phenomenal. We are today still blessed with things that he discovered.
True.
He created the first library, first post office, first fire department, and electricity.
Shocking.
So, so I thought I would start with a couple stories that happened during reenactments and things of that nature. Because what do you do when you reenact? Is you actually bring to life the past, and you sometimes play a real character, a person who had actually lived and died. Some of the reenactors actually adopt a real person and portray that person. They get into as much of the nuances of that person's life as they humanly can. And I cannot think of anything more flattering if you are from beyond than to find that somebody is interested in every facet of your life. And others create personas that represent a type of people, like maybe a Scotch-Irish immigrant or a French person coming here during the colonial period. They create a character that's fictional, but also representative of what would have happened to a person of that nationality and that wealth level, whatever it is.
Okay.
And so that's some of the things you need to know. So I was working school marm at Old Bedford Village. This was probably 15 years ago now. And we had a very interesting spring event. It was early in the spring, about May, I believe. And they had brought in a lot of reenactors and living historians to represent that time period. And then, of course, the tourists would pass through. There's 43 cabins in the village. Not everyone is open to the public, but there are 43 cabins, and the vast majority of which are what are known as second generation. First generation are usually one room, but there's a few of those that are one room there as well, including one that Washington had built,
Yep.
had built, I should say. And there's a little building over there called the Eight Square Church or Schoolhouse, and the Eight Square Schoolhouse is built in an octagon style because during that time period there were a lot of dangers. So kids would come to school, and the older boys and girls would bring a gun with them to get them through the woods safely. And they were looking for things like Indian attack, highwaymen, anything like that that could be dangerous. And then the kids would sit. If you would go into the school, you'll see all the small children's seating is aimed to the center of the room where the teacher would stand. And then 3 steps up, there's a whole platform, and on that platform are the larger children's desks. There are not nearly as many of them because more of those kids would be at home now working fields and what have you. Not all of them would get to come to school through the age of 14 or something of that nature. And their desks are not looking inward at the teacher, but rather out a window so they can see trouble coming.
Makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So it is into that framework that this story occurred. So we had some Native Americans who would come to represent their people's interest and what a colonial village would have looked like. There would have been Native Americans walking around. They would be trading, just passing through different things. So there was a group of men who came who were Native American reenactors who were doing that. There was a little girl about 10 years old, I'd say, and she saw me at the school marming, and I was out sweeping the porch or something, and this little girl saw me, and she came hell for leather, elbows and knees, as fast as she could, screaming, and she darted up behind me, and she's like, he's gonna get me, and I'm like, who? And she pointed, and there was a young Native American man in his early 20s standing off in the distance, and I guess he had walked past her and had said something to her, and it scared her. They look fierce. They are in breeches. Their chests are bare or have the breastwork on them. Their faces are painted. They've got the feathers in their hair. They look very fierce. And he's just standing there. And I said, oh, he's not going to hurt you, honey. And she's like, no, he looks mean. And I said, no, honey, he's not going to hurt you. And I calmed her down. And he's still standing there. You can see he's watching the situation, concerned. I think he was hurt that he scared her. I don't think he meant to scare her. And I calmed her down and we talked. And I thought this is a good moment to have an education. That, we don't judge people by their look necessarily. And to explain to her that in the colonial period, he would have been perfectly welcome in this town. So I asked her if it was okay if we asked him to come in, and she said yes. So I went over to the door and I talked to her and got her permission again and went out and said to him, come on over. And he said no. She said no. And I said, no, it's okay. I want her to be introduced to you. And he's like, bring her out to me. And I said, oh, okay. So I went in and I said, he would like us to come outside in the sunshine. And we went over and we talked, and he got down on his knees and let her touch the paint on his face and touch the breastwork on his chest and the artwork that he was wearing and all of this. And they talked for 15-20 minutes. And when she left, she was all excited because she wasn't afraid anymore, which was wonderful. And I said to him, thank you. And he stood up and I shook his hand and he said, I didn't want to be rude telling you to bring her out, but I can't go into that school. And I said, oh, why can't you go into the school? And he said, because when I looked at you in the doorway, behind you was a man, and he was very angry and stern, and he was shaking his head no. And I didn't want to interfere with that spirit.
Wow. And were you aware, because you're sensitive, were you aware that there was something there?
I knew the building had a story and a history, but I wasn't at that moment because I was so fixated on that child and calming her. I will tell you, since then, I run a paranormal group, and the group went there, and we sealed that building off with recorders, voice-activated recorders inside of it, because staff there have, over the years, heard children. They've heard a woman talking. They've heard a man. They've heard what sounds like a stick smacking on a piece of a table or something like that. And so we sealed off the building. There's 2 doors, a front and a back door. And somebody sat at each door outside and watched just to make sure nobody went in or out. And we have caught laughter, what sounds like recitation, children reading something by rote. We've caught that thumping sound, things like that. So I found it fascinating, and it's one of the buildings in the village that has history and ghost stories attached to it. There's a couple others. There's a church that's a replica church, but the furniture in it's from a real church. And so it seems as though we call him the deacon. And I was first brought, I've heard the stories in the past from a previous curator who was brought the stories by reenactors. So in the off season, the village, you can rent the buildings or you can rent the whole village. And reenactors will sometimes do that for a weekend or a week or something like that and have a private reenactment that's just for them. Maybe it's to practice or maybe it's just to kind of hang out and spend some time with their reenacting family. And multiple reenactment groups that had rented the village over the course of a year had come to the then director at the time and had told him the same sorts of stories about the same series of buildings. And these men and women were not related in any fashion. So they were reenactors from, New York, and then some from the Carolinas, and then somebody from Illinois. They didn't have any interaction amongst them to pass the stories along. So he began to take note of this and make notes, and then he came and contacted me and said, "Hey, Patty, I think you need to hear this. This is really interesting." This was probably a good 20 years ago. And so I've been collecting stories of the village ever since. But that building, the church building, has consistently had reports of this guy called the deacon. He gets very upset when somebody is disrespectful and goes up onto the altar area. He finds that disrespectful. They've used the church for weddings. You can rent this church for weddings. And multiple different people who knew nothing about the history, but just wanted this beautiful picturesque building for a wedding. Them and family members have had experiences of bathroom doors opening and closing on their own, things locking or being moved when the building's been locked, like they decorated it before the wedding the night before and come in the next day and all the flowers are off the backs of the pews, or things are piled in a corner. There's also a little child, a little girl of about 4, who is seen on the upper floor of the building. It's a 2-story church building. You can look at the church floor from the 2nd story. And it's interesting that there's been the same sets of stories repeatedly throughout the years. So those are 2 of the buildings that are haunted or to be haunted in the village. And, there are many other ghost stories that I have heard about there. And it's just a fascinating thing. So those are my first forays into mixing the 2. And I have a passion for that. The Jean Bonnet Tavern, built in officially 1762, but unofficially was considered an old abandoned French fort in 1690. Okay, so we know it dated further back, the basement level. And it has a plethora of hauntings, literally a half dozen or more.
The moment I learned about the Jean Bonnet Tavern, I said to Mrs. Stu, "We're going to go. We're going to get a meal." Just because some of the patrons have seen things. So I said maybe we'll get lucky and see something. So, but we didn't. But it was still a good dining experience. Yeah.
The food is phenomenal at the Jean Bonnet. It is my favorite place in this area to eat. I have one particular meal that I'm absolutely in love with, and but there are ghost stories, many ghost stories that have happened to people that are just patrons. There was, historically speaking, it is where a group of soldiers from Fort Bedford bivouacked, waiting for another group of soldiers to meet up with them during the Whiskey Rebellion. They were going to go westward to help quelch the rebellion that was going on. And they ended up staying there for several days. At that point in time, the only people that were moving were wagon masters, teamsters, traders, people like that, that had to sell their wares or were in commerce in some fashion. Most people didn't travel a lot. Like when you got to where you were going to settle, you just stayed there. You may have traveled 2 miles into town once in a while, but that was about it. You didn't, get on the road and travel a long distance. So those people who traveled could spy, and they could sell the troop movements and what have you to the other side, and what, you know, that sort of thing. And there's a couple really wonderful stories that date all the way back to the mid 1700s from that. And I will probably do one episode that's just really concentrating on that, because as I said, there are 6 sets of stories. But I wanted to share some of the local reasons I find the two mix well. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about some other historic places. So one of the most historic places we all think of is Yorktown. And Yorktown battlefield has multitudes of ghost stories. So the Battle of Yorktown was a real battle, the British versus the Americans, or colonials as they were called at the time. And during the Revolutionary War, there were more than one battle there, but there is one central battle that is known as the Battle of Yorktown.
Right.
There, the British took over Yorktown area, and when they would come into an area, they would take the finer homes and turn them into officers' quarters. So there was a gentleman by the name of Mr. Nelson, who had the finest home in the entire area. Actually, he was in the colonial government and working his way up through the colonial government. And the home is gorgeous. It was a mansion. And he had hidden his money. Banks weren't trusted back then. Hidden his money inside the walls of his house in 3 different locations. And unbeknownst to most people, there was a hidden staircase in the house as well. And so when his house was taken over by British officers, he and Lafayette, General Lafayette, who was a friend of his and a very young officer from France who came here and really helped us win the American Revolutionary War. I can't overstate that, because without the French's help, we probably wouldn't have won. They brought us men, materials, everything we needed when we were basically running out of all of it, and helped turn the tide. So anyhow, Lafayette and them are attacking these soldiers, these British soldiers, and they're in this huge battle. And Lafayette's asked, "Where do I aim the cannons?" Well, he said to the cannonade officers, "Talk to Commander Nelson," because Nelson's the guy's home who's in direct line of fire. And he didn't want to give the order to blow up his friend's home, even though he knew there were British officers in there. That's a rough order, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And Nelson said, to his credit, he pointed straight ahead at his house and he said, "You see that house there? Blow it up. They're inside of there. It has to go."
Talk
That's
about your Pyrrhic victory. Yeah.
You know, I mean, to me, that's historically speaking, that's amazing that he put his own self-worth and his own, you know, his own desire to keep his home aside and recognize that he needed to do this, and he just did it.
He put the cause before his own. Yeah.
Yeah, he did. I admire him for that. So anyhow, they began to blow holes into the house, and the first cannon that shot through the house actually went through a room where there was a group of British officers sitting at a table, and it went across the table and took out several of the officers and blew a hole in the wall. Over the course of the battle, there were 3 or 4 huge holes that were blown into the walls. One of the British soldiers had found the hidden staircase and was hiding in the staircase. And when the cannon went through the room, then killed those men at the table, and struck that wall, it actually collapsed the staircase around him, and he died. This is important to the story. So there have been many reports of men in red coats seen running across the fields and the yards of this property and across the parts of the battlefield beyond it. But in the house, there's always been these ghost stories, these legends. And it was interesting because in the 1960s, there was a woman who, her and her husband owned the house. The house has been completely restored. It's absolutely gorgeous. It is as pristine as it was in Nelson's time. And she was holding a dinner party, and she was asked, "Oh, we hear that the house has a ghost story." And she laughed and she said, according to those who were present, "Oh, yes, but I discount that. It's a bunch of frippery." At which point the door in the wall for the hidden staircase blew itself open very hard,
Okay.
quivered, and then slammed itself shut in full view of the entire dining party of about 25 people. And at that point, the frippery went out the window and they all went out the room.
Mm-hmm. Like, au contraire. Yeah.
He's letting you know there's still stuff there. So I thought that was fascinating. Now, the building itself, although damaged, was structurally sound during the time of the battle. It became a field hospital. Whoever had the ground used it as a field hospital at that time. So for a while, the British were using it, then the colonials would use it, and as that whole mess was going on. You'll find that in a lot of places. Now, they did surgeries on the first floor, crude as they would have been. And you need to know that if you were shot or had shrapnel or anything like that in your arm or your leg, there really was no other opportunity to save your life rather than just amputating. So there were stories, much like you'll find in the Civil War, about piles of arms and legs outside of windows, the smell of the blood and the rot, that sort of thing. And people convalesced in a second. And I don't understand this, but I've come across this multiple times. They would take the most injured and put them in the attic, which to me seems counterintuitive in so many ways.
It would take longer to get to them. Right.
And it's hotter and it's more miserable. And, yeah, it just makes no sense. But there's a house in Maryland where that happened. And the men actually wrote on the horsehair plaster messages to their dying loved ones. I've been up in that attic of that house. It's a public house now, a restaurant. And it's just really sad to read some of their messages because they knew they were dying and in terrible ways. But in the Nelson house is no different. They put the most badly injured, the amputees and what have you, up in the attic, which makes, again, no sense to me. So the smell of rot and gangrene and what have you permeated the attic in the house. And there are times when people will smell that smell to this day, even though everything has, 200 years ago has been cleaned out and it doesn't have that scent, but you'll just be up there looking for something or working, and people that have lived in the house or worked in the house have talked about it overwhelming them as though somebody is standing right beside them with gangrene.
Hmm.
So it has those kinds of ghost stories attached. And the battlefield has a couple other ghost stories. I'd like to tell you the story of Jackie Custis. Jackie Custis was a young man who was born with everything. His father was well-to-do. His mother had a great deal of money as well. And when they got married, it was a huge wealth, land and money and prestige. And Jackie's father died, leaving him and his mother and his sister without a father and husband. And she would eventually meet this guy who, although he was dashing and a rogue in so many ways and what have you, he had never managed to get much success financially. And then he chose, I don't want to say the wrong side, but the side that most people would have not believed to be the right side during the American Revolution. And so she marries this man, and he becomes stepfather to Jackie Custis. This man would be George Washington.
Oh, okay.
So this was his stepson. And Jackie was kind of a ne'er-do-well. He failed at everything he tried. Whatever he put his hand to, it just didn't pan out. And he just kept failing. So Washington decided to take it in hand and teach him how to be a soldier. And he was doing really good at it too. Like, he was an aide de camp to Washington, so Washington could keep an eye on him. But he was learning and he was doing pretty good by everybody's estimation. And then he got dysentery while he was out in Yorktown. Dysentery, by the way, killed more people than the actual battles most of the time. It was the scourge of every war. And so he got dysentery, and a doctor was called in to treat him, which was unusual, but because Washington paid for it privately, a physician was brought in, which might actually have been the undoing of poor Jackie, because the prescription was to bleed him.
I was thinking, either bloodletting or leeches.
So they bled him by cutting his legs at his ankles, which was very unusual. I mean, normally it was, an arm or something. But this doctor chose to bleed him at his ankles. And he would die. He was in a weakened condition from the dysentery, and then to have had bloodletting done a couple times in the mistaken belief that it was going to let the tainted blood out. Mm-hmm. He would die. He has been seen on the battlefield near the area where his tent had been. He's there very distinctive because he's in his nightshirt and he's got bandages around his ankles. And he seems to be trying to reach somewhere. He's hurrying, hobbling along, and then he just disappears.
Interesting.
So I think that's a fascinating story. And I think the thing I love about the ghost stories in this period is it's very educational. Like, you are learning so much about history at the same time you're learning these ghost stories. And they're so woven together. It'd be one thing to say there's this boy hobbling along the battlefield. That's just tragic. But to know who he is and how he died and what was going on, and then Washington had to go home and tell his boy's mother, his wife, Martha, that her son had died. And he's still hurrying somewhere. Nobody knows where, but he's definitely hurrying somewhere. So another story that I'd like to share today is something, this is a story I've been following and reading since I was 13. There's a wonderful character named Ocean-born Mary. That's the legend of her, Ocean-born Mary. And she was a real woman. She had a fascinating life. So her name was Mary Wilson Wallace, is her married name. She was born in 1720. And the story goes, and this is a true story, even the State Historical Society in New Hampshire will validate this part of the story. So Mary's mother was pregnant. Her and her husband were on their way across the Atlantic Ocean. On July 26th of 1720, they were attacked by pirates. And normally, the passengers were literally, unless they were well-to-do and could be ransomed, they were just thrown into the ocean to die. It was the ship and cargo that was worth money. So the pirates come on board, and as the pirates got the people all lined up, they hear this screaming from down below. And it's this poor woman who's just gone into labor from fear, and she's trying to give birth in her cabin. And he goes down, the commander of the pirates, and he finds this woman. He kicks in the door, and she's laying there giving birth. And some stories say that he helped birth the child, or that he was just there at the moment of the child's birth. And he was a father too in his own way, but he looks at this child with these green blue eyes and this head of red hair, and he says to the mother, "If you will name her Mary for my mother, whose hair was as red as hers, I will spare you all." And she says, "I will."
Oh, who wouldn't?
Yeah, I mean, like, you're not arguing this deal. This is like life-saving for all of these people. And he orders his pirates, who are none too pleased because they're losing a whole bunch of money, to get off this boat, let the ship go on its way, and get back on their ship. Well, he had a privateer, which is a very fast sloop that he sailed on. And a little bit later, the sloop came up in the horizon again, and it quickly overtakes this poor ship, and everybody thinks, "Oh my God, he changed his mind." And he does overtake the ship, and he does take it again, but only because he wants to bring Mary a present. He brings this bolt of cloth, this beautiful emerald green cloth, that he had stolen on some other ship. And he brings it and he gives it to the mother, and he says for her to make her dress, make her wedding dress with it. And he leaves. And so the bolt of cloth does travel along with this child, and she will get married in a dress made out of that bolt of cloth. Now, here's where the Historical Society wants to kill the ghost story. But the ghost story continues on this way. So when Mary was an adult, she would become a widow, and this pirate, who's now an old man, finds her. He's kind of kept tabs on her from a distance, apparently, according to the ghost story. And he and her strike up a friendship, a relationship. Some stories say that she was his caregiver. Some say that they got married. There's different stories, and there's really no way to validate one. So I'm just going to say that they became very close, and that the house that she was living in, he helped fund it being built and what have you, and that she has been seen on this property since her death many, many times. She would die in 1814, and the house is still known as Oceanborn Mary's home, and it is believed that she haunts it to this day. She's seen walking across the property. She's seen looking out the windows. She's quite distinctive because she has this long, flaming red hair and these glittering green-blue eyes that are very arresting. And she was a very tall, broad-shouldered woman, and she's not easy to miss.
I thought you were going to say she was wearing the green dress.
No, she's not. I mean, to the best of my ability to tell, I've never come across anybody saying that they saw her wearing the green dress. But on the other hand, she's been seen repeatedly, and it's just fascinating. And this story has been documented probably dozens of times in books, dating all the way back to the mid 1800s.
Okay.
So it's fascinating to me that it's survived that long. Another really cool house that's haunted is called the Spooner House in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And the story goes that the house is haunted by a little girl. She was a 4-year-old little girl. She was adopted by the family. She was apparently orphaned and adopted by the family that owned the house at the time. And they grew to love her and care for her. And she ended up with an infected tooth at the age of 4. And unfortunately, because there were no antibiotics, the infection began to eat at her jaw. And in a very slow, painful death, this child died. They brought doctors in. They did everything they could. The family spared no expense, but the little girl passed away. Fast forward to, throughout the years, people have said they've seen this little girl in multitudes of places and ways throughout the house. But in 2005, a very interesting story had happened. So the house was now kind of a museum, and it's only occupied during the daytime. A group of workmen were hired to do some repairs at the Spooner house, and they arrived early one day and knocked on the door. A little girl came, opened up the door. She was in colonial clothing, and they said, "We're here to do the repairs." And she just opened the door and waved them on in, and then she disappeared. They didn't think back the hallway. So they didn't think a whole lot about it because they knew that the place had a living history, people that lived here. So it wouldn't be insane to see a child dressed in colonial garb, because a lot of living history people bring their families. And, if you're in Bedford Village in the summertime, you'll see entire families coming through dressed in colonial clothes, including their small children. So they didn't think much about it, and they're working away at it, and the curator shows up a little while later, and he's like, "How did you get into the building?" And they're like, "Well, the little girl let us in." He's like, "There's no little girl here." And they're like, No, yeah, we saw her. All of us saw her. She was about 4 years old, little blonde girl, colonial clothing, We knocked on the door. She opened the door. And we told her we were here to do the work, and she went down that hallway. And the guy just stood there for a minute. He said, "Oh, that's Abigail. Abigail Townsend. Funny, I haven't heard from her for a while." But the stories of her being there are fascinating. She's been seen in the house, looking out the windows of the house. Passersby have seen her. Now, the house is also supposed to be haunted by James Townsend, who owned the house. He was fascinated with music. Some of the ghost stories say that it's this little girl, Abigail, who plays the music, but that doesn't make a lot of sense. She was 4. But we do know that James Spooner loved it. Excuse me, James Townsend. James Spooner loved the house, that he loved music, and a lot of his personal possessions are in the house. It is guesstimated that he is probably the gentleman who's seen in the drawing room listening to music. There's no paintings or photographs of him that can confirm it, but it definitely looks like it might be him. He was very partial to music, judging from letters and journals and what have you. So that would make the most sense. Obviously, a 4-year-old child wouldn't be able to play music at her age, that kind of music, grand music with pianos and what have you.
Or but even crank a Victrola.
Well, which they didn't even have in the 1700s, yeah. So one of my favorite stories, and the last story about the Spooner house, is there was a Colonial Lantern tour that went through. And, like a lot of areas that have a lot of history, they do a lot of these colonial walking tours and stuff. And we do some in Bedford County as well. And during this tour, the person who was leading it, carrying her little lantern, stopped and told the stories at Spooner House. And there were lights going from room to room upstairs, as though there was somebody carrying a candle or something. And it would go down the steps, and then you would see light on the first floor a little bit, and then up the steps, and then back up to the second floor, almost as if somebody was very busy. So one of the guests on the tour said, "Can we shine a flashlight, in between the shutters and see if there's anybody in there?" I mean, you're in a ghost story tour, and all of a sudden the house is active. You're curious,
Sure.
So the guide obliged, and she shined the light in between the shutters to see if there was anybody there, at which point the shutters flew open, and there was a woman standing at the window in colonial clothing. And as they backed away screaming, she disappeared, and they ran. Who the woman is, I don't know, and this is the only mention of her. But she disappeared in front of them.
The behavior of the people still baffles me. Why run?
I don't know. I think it's their conditioning, the conditioning of what we see on TV, what we're told to feel, the unknown. I think it's a little bit of all of that together. But I like that story because that's cool. I'm sorry, but if I was looking through the shutters and the shutter flew open and I could see that woman standing there, I would be taking pictures like that.
Oh, absolutely. That's why I said it baffles me to think that people would run away from an opportunity like that.
I guess I don't see it as an opportunity in that moment. So, and maybe it depends on the feeling you have with it. I've been in places that are really haunted that are not scary, and I've been in places that are really haunted that you have to kind of hold your breath and make yourself stand your ground, because my job isn't to run away, it's to go toward it. But if you're just a tourist, it's not your job necessarily, so they bailed.
But if you're on a tour like that in the first place, I mean, you would think you'd at least have some inkling or some type of interest in the topic.
I will tell you, people have an interest, and quite often they're fascinated enough that they would like to have something happen, but then when it does happen, a lot of times they get freaked out. Now, I've done a paranormal walking tour in Bedford in October for years, off and on, and the very first year we did the tour, a friend of mine was with me, and we were doing it back and forth because it's a lot of talking for one person. And that allowed people to, rest your breath and your throat a minute and get a drink of water. And then you would sort of drop to the back of the tour and kind of herd everybody forward and then switch out. So we were on our last site here in Bedford, and it's the Bedford Tavern is the site. And we're standing there back to the building itself, and it was during fall foliage. Bedford has something called fall foliage, and it's this great big festival where every person who makes crafts comes and they share their wares, and you can buy stuff. And a lot of people do their Christmas shopping, and literally sometimes there's 10,000 people in this town, and on a weekend visiting. And it's the first 2 weekends of October, so it was one of those 2 weekends. And 10 o'clock at night, the town's finally winding down. The tavern's still hopping because they're serving alcohol and food. And there's really not a lot of things open late at night in Bedford. So we're standing there telling our ghost story about the gentleman who supposedly haunts the top floor of the building. And this figure in white leans like the upper torso and looks out the window and then backs up. And I'm standing there watching this while the other person's talking with his back to the building. And the other people are watching. There's probably 40 people on this particular group. And they're pointing up, and it happens like 2 or 3 more times where this figure just leans out and like he's looking out the window at us, or it's looking out the window at us. You couldn't tell male or female. And my thought was that it was the then owner of the building playing a prank because he knew we were going to do it. Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
So that was my first thought. And everybody got my other storyteller's attention and was like, "Oh, did you see the white figure up there?" And they're looking at me, and I'm like, "Yeah, there was." And I mouthed the name of the then owner, and he shook it. The other person shook his head, and he's like, "Yeah, we both believe with every fiber of our being it was this guy, because he was a bit of a prankster." So after the tour ends there at that building, we go down and decide to have some late supper. We're sitting there, and this gentleman's wife comes out. She's waitressing. The place is just packed. And we say to her, "So, top floor of your building was haunted tonight." And she's like, "Yeah, we heard. Some of the people from the tour have been here, and they're all talking about it." And I said, "Yeah, but it was your husband." And she's like, "What?" And I said, "No, it's got to be your husband." She's like, "Patty, he's the only cook back there tonight. He hasn't been out of that kitchen in 10 hours. And I'm like, "No, seriously." So he comes out just about that time, wiping his hands off, and he goes, "Hey, how did you get the keys to the upstairs? Did you see my old man today?" And I'm like, "What?" He's like, "No, seriously. Did Dad give you the keys to the upstairs so you could pull a prank for your tour or what? Because there's people over here talking about it, and I would like to know what happened." So at that point, we all go upstairs, and the truth of the matter was that that top floor apartment wasn't being rented at the time, because it was between renters. You have to, you clean the building up, and you paint the apartment, and you do all this, and that's what was going to be happening. So all that was in that apartment that night was some cans of paint, some tarps on the floor, that sort of stuff, and a ladder. And the apartment was locked from the outside, and we didn't have the keys. And I'll have to just leave it at that. The guy sounded genuinely baffled, and he never changed his story, never once made a joke about it.
So somebody not painting, wearing the painter's whites, and just leave his head out, having a good old time.
It was just a white mass. There was no face. It was just a white mass. And that's all you could see. You couldn't see anything identifying like a face to say it's male or female. Just this white mass kind of bopping. It almost reminded you of somebody bending at their waist, looking out sideways, but nothing identifiable as a human. I thought he had a sheet over his head. That's that kind of white.
Okay.
I have no clue what it was, but you find these kind of interesting, odd moments. So it does happen on tours, and I know in Gettysburg, because I'm friends with Mark, and he runs the tours down there. There have been multiple incidents over the years. So it's possible, you could be on a tour and poof, something happens.
I've been with Mrs. Stew and Mrs. Stew's sister and her family at the Artillery Ridge Campground in Gettysburg. And, as we toured always looking, anytime I go to Gettysburg, I'm always got my eye peeled for something going on. But
yeah, and we'll do a Civil War time, maybe closer to the anniversary of the Gettysburg Battle, and I'll tell you stories that we've seen and heard and been part of in some way. There's just tons of them all the time. But people don't think so much about the colonial and the revolutionary period, but these ghost stories still exist. We just don't, for some reason, they don't feature them on the TV show, so people don't talk about them much.
well, do they fade after time so that there's fewer of them?
I think there might be fewer of them, but these houses have consistently, these properties and parcels of land have consistently had ghost stories for, 200 plus years, and they haven't faded out. There are places, there's this place in England where they were working on, in the basement on, I think it was the plumbing pipes and stuff that came from the street into the building. And the workmen reported seeing a legion of Roman soldiers marching along, and you could only see them from, I believe it was the knees up. Well, it made no sense to them, but when they got upstairs and said, "You're not going to believe what the heck we saw," they found that this place was actually built over an old Roman road that the Roman legion had used when they had taken England, and that the foundation for the house was about 2.5, 3 feet above that road. So if they were marching on the road as it existed, it would have been at about knee level. That's kind of a, I guess, so some stories do seem to linger.
Oh, and there's, having been in Europe, I know there's Roman ruins proliferating the continent. Yeah.
Yes. But I think that story comes from, I believe, the 1950s. That was the last thing these people were thinking about was Roman soldiers marching past them, but they marched right through the wall and through the building and kept on going.
Now that I would be interested in, just to see the, what they were wearing, how the helmets and the swords and things like that were crafted. That would be interesting to me. But I guess I don't have the passion for American history that you do.
I think a lot of people struggle with it because history was always presented in a boring fashion. You know what I mean? It's facts and figures and dates. And it's not. It's living and dynamic, and it changes. If you find one fact, history changes, and there's nothing static about it. And I think everybody has a time period that they're fascinated with. My proficiency with the Civil War really is rather an offshoot of the fact that Mark's a federal historian, so for the Civil War. And so as his friend, I've absorbed countless pieces of history at his knee. And I have a dear friend, Ray Beck, who was the state historian for North Carolina, and I've absorbed a great deal of history from Ray over the years. But colonial and French and Indian period, I will tell you, I wouldn't have wanted to live it because it was violent in a way that was terrifying. Everybody was a combatant. You couldn't be neutral in that time frame. You could be sitting in your cabin in the middle of the woods, not doing a thing to anybody. And if the wrong group of people came across you, they could justify killing you, taking you as slave, doing whatever it is they did to you, and burning your home and killing your children. And it was that way both for the Native Americans and for the American citizens, the Britishers and the French and whoever else was coming here. And people don't ever look at the geopolitical issues that are part of the history. Like, people think, oh, these white people came over and they took all this land from the Indians. It's a lot more complicated than that. They were lied to, and the British government had a plan, and the plan was to get these white people to come over here and take the land and defeat the Indians, and they tell them, it's okay, we've already treated for this land, it's safe, go ahead, which is a lie. Because they don't really care if they win or they lose, they're going to take the land back anyway, and they do. So then it's now cleared, it's now got some sort of a structure on it, it's got, fields or gardens to it. Now they come back in, and if these people are dead, they just take that land that's already been improved and keep on going. It was a plan that was put into place. The American government would do the exact same thing with people moving westward and the westward expansion. If you look at probably Charles Ingalls in The Little House on the Prairie, if you look at that, you'll see that dynamic in the actual story. He actually waited for the government to let them know that they had treated with the Native Americans and that they were allowed to go and settle in a certain area. He would settle there and for almost 2 years live there, managed to get his barns built, managed to get gardens and fields plowed and cleaned. And then the Americans came through and said, oh, well, this land wasn't treated for after all, so you need to leave. It would be the bitterness in his life because he lost everything.
Oh, I bet.
So, so there's all this other stuff that goes with a story, with a historical story that people don't talk about. They just see little tiny bits and pieces and go, that's it, that's the story. But it's not the story. These people, these Americans, these white people that were used, that came over here, and French, Africans who came, anybody who came, they were all being lied to and used at the beginning. That's what the whole plan is. We can have them clean the land off, improve the land, and we can go in after the Indians. They assumed that the Indians would kill them, and now we have justification to kill the Indians, and now we have all the land. We win.
It's no wonder that people don't trust governments.
Yeah, it's been going on forever. They just had better PR in recent years and tried to convince us that it's safer now. But so I find all history fascinating. I travel through it, but the French and Indian period and the colonial period speak to my soul in some way.
But you're correct. Looking back at my schooling, history was boring. Even the times that they wheeled in the cart when you got to watch a film or a film strip in the middle of history class, it was still boring.
So I have to say, I was always fascinated with history, but I had the most amazing history teacher in high school. His name was John Ashman. Thank you, Mr. Ashman. And Mr. Ashman was the total antithesis of that teacher. What he would do is he would sit there and he would make little knots in a piece of string, like make little knots of sorts, and he would kick his feet up onto the desk and he would rear his chair back on two legs and he would say, okay, today we're going to talk about, and then he would tell stories and he would make it come alive. And for 40 minutes, everybody in the room held their breath. And at the age of 13, 14 years old, that passion for storytelling just exploded inside of me. Thank you, John Ashman, eternally. He knows this. He and I have talked.
Okay.
So he still lives in my hometown. So it wasn't static for me. It was dynamic. It was
alive.
Yeah, it was alive. There were so many things going on, and I learned at his tutelage that history isn't ever written in stone. It's always, subject to change. If you find a new set of facts, that could change the history. Finding there's a ghost story that I talk about in Chambersburg, and by that ghost story, we found a Confederate soldier who had been lost for 100 and at that time 150 years, and that changed national history. So now he's not missing at the Battle of Gettysburg. He's buried in Chambersburg, and I can tell you how he got there.
You have, yes.
Yeah. So I'm saying, so it changes everything, and history's never static. You just have to. My kids, you have to go out and live it. My kids loved history because I took them to the battlefields. They fired cannons. They crawled across and learned how to stomach crawl across fields with Confederate soldiers. All of that stuff happened because I believe history has to live and breathe. And then we're doing a disservice to our children to not let that be so. Whatever the history. I guess that's where my passion comes from.
Understandable.
I know it's, and like I said, I hope that folks will bear with me for this episode. I promise to get back to creepy crawly things. I promise. I'm just in a very, very, I've been submerging myself a great deal in colonial history this last 4 or 5 weeks. And so it comes bubbling up in odd ways like ghost stories. So it just is what it is for me. So one last story. We cannot go without a Mad Anthony Wayne. So Anthony Wayne was a military genius during the American Revolution. He is underestimated by historians, and I can prove it. He got the name Mad Anthony Wayne because of his daring exploits, which people would hear about and they would say, oh my God, that man is mad. On at least 3 occasions, he saved General Washington. Twice he saved his life. Once he saved his stewardship as our commander-in-chief. And this story is about Wayne when he died. So Wayne was stationed up in Erie when he died. And travel wasn't, as it is today, very quick and instantaneous. So, somebody had to go and tell his family all the way down in the southeastern part of the state that he had died. You can't let a body lay for a month while you're traveling. So he had to be interred. So he was interred at the blockhouse on Fort Prescott. And there he lay for several years. His son, when he became an adult, decided to fulfill his mother's request and go get his father's bones and bring him home to bury in the family cemetery. So he rode up to Lake Erie to Presque Isle, and he brought a satchel to carry the bones home, because after 10 years they should have, there should be nothing left on them pretty much. But the very rich peat around the Presque Isle blockhouse preserved the body, and much to everybody's horror, I'm sure especially his son's, when he was disinterred, he was pretty much still intact. And so now the question becomes, how do we get him home? I don't know how they made this leap, because I have to tell you, it would not be my first thought. I would be thinking, oh crap, I got to rent a wagon to take the casket home. Not his son. So he conferred with a couple local doctors, and they came up with this grand plan that they could boil his bones, and he could take the bones home, and they would rebury the sludge, the flesh in the sludge. And to my absolute shock, he said yes. So there's actually a kettle up in the Historical Society, in the planetarium in Lake Erie area, which is the actual kettle they boiled Mad Anthony's bones in. And it still exists, and it's on display. So he packs the bones in that satchel he brought. His father's skin is reburied at the blockhouse, and he starts the journey home. And he packed the bones badly. So as he's bouncing along on the horseback, some of the bones come tumbling out. And it takes him quite a while to realize this. And there's really no way to know where he dropped the bones. And so he can't go retrieve them. So he brings most of his father back, and his father's interred at the cemetery. There is a legend, or story if you wish, that on January 1st, Mad Anthony's birthday, he starts a ride at Lake Erie at Presque Isle, following the path his son took, riding along looking for his lost bones. As he has never found them, he has never stopped the journey. So every January, he mounts his horse, his phantom steed, and starts the journey once more.
Considering the distance, yeah, that would take a lot longer than just January 1st.
It would indeed. He is seen along, for like 2 or 3 week period, the story goes, that he's seen in different places along the way.
Whenever you first saying that they were going to try to find a way to bring the bones back, it's rather macabre, but the first thing that went through my mind is, well, we'll just fold him.
Well, folding him might have been a little less draconian than what they did. I mean, I have never in my entire life figured out how we would get from, oh, dad's still intact, I should probably get a casket. And I mean, they were well-to-do people, they could afford it, and a wagon, and take him home that way, to, hey, let's just boil him.
That's certainly unique. I would say that, and I really hope that that kettle wasn't used for fish or potato chips or anything after that.
I have no clue what it was used for, if anything, ever after. But the kettle still exists, and it was on display. I believe it was at the planetarium for quite a long time. It's huge, absolutely huge, and I mean, there's no other word for it. It's a huge cauldron, cast iron cauldron.
It would have to be that big if you're going to make General Soup.
I know. So that was my last story for this day. I hope everybody enjoyed it, and if not, I hope you will bear with me as I go wandering through my colonial ghostly tales.
Well, if you look through a lot of the stories that you have in your books, many of them date back to those times.
Oh, they do indeed, because there's a lot of history and a lot of ghost stories from those time periods. Passionate times make good ghost stories, you know. And I can't tell you of anything more passionate than the risks that were taken by these men and women who created this country. They literally, when they signed their name to the Declaration of Independence, when they started on this journey, they knew that they had two endings, one of which would befall them. One would be death because of treason. The other was success. And by no means was it assured that they were going to succeed. So, I mean, that kind of passion breeds, you know, that longevity, the kind of emotion that causes a ghostly tale to continue for quite a while.
And we're happy to bring them to you, our viewers and listeners. And notice that segue. Yeah. So, if you're listening to this or watching it, we thank you. Please tell friends and family about us. Subscribe to our YouTube channel if you can, the Paranormalist Podcast. Click the subscribe button that's here, the little bell over there to be notified when we release new content, which hopefully will be soon. We also have the Facebook page, the Paranormalist Podcast, which has been growing very, very successfully, and we thank everybody. And the same thing too, please tell anybody else you think may be interested in the content. And you may also email us at theparanormalist@theparanormalistpodcast.com with your ideas, stories, comments, and we'll be happy to read those and take them under consideration.
So for this evening, have a good night, everybody, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Patty. Good night.
Night.